I can't hear you. I hope that's not me.
Marco Polo.
There we go. There we go.
Sorry about that, everybody. Oh, what an incredible journey. I'm sorry. This is I want to say it's usually better, but it's not. I love my audience because I've set a very low bar, and we're still okay. But today I'm doing pretty good. I got Ted effing Neward. That's your middle name, I'm sure.
Yes, that is exactly what is printed on the birth certificate, because my mom and my dad were, arguing over what my middle name should be, and finally they just said F it, and that's what they put on there.
Checks out. No, I mean, so I have.
Find your center. Find your.
No, I'm a huge Ted Neward fan, and I work primarily in Java. But I know that there are Josh doppelgangers in a number of other communities that could say the same, that they are huge Ted Neward fans, because you're one of those polyglots that I keep hearing stories about, but have never encountered, except in the hypotheticals. You and Venkat.
Yeah.
And so, so to say you're busy is an understatement.
Well, to say that I know a lot of stuff, that's true. Busy, that's a completely different story, right? I was one of the victims of the economy in 2022, and I'm still looking to climb back onto the cycle and find that next big thing. So busy right now, teaching at the University of Washington, teaching Android this quarter and iOS next quarter. And then, yeah. So
can you imagine? Because that's how do I put this delicately? People are paying for 1 unit of that course with you, what they would normally pay for just a couple of days workshop with you in another context. Like they're getting a whole semester with Ted effing Neward. That is, I wish I could be there. I would temporarily relocate to your state, which I shall not, privacy concerns, name.
Well, I did say the University of Washington, so that does kind of give it away.
Sorry.
Yeah. To all those who are desperately interested in stalking me, yes, I live in Washington State, and I live in the Seattle area. And if you really want to drive around the entire Seattle area looking for me, good luck. So
Seattle's worth visiting, but not for that.
Well, I mean, I love Seattle. I used to live in Northern California. I used to live in Southern California. And I'm home. I like this place. I like the people up here. I like the tech sector up here. There's a lot of things to like about up here. So
clearly.
No, the funny thing that you were talking about, Josh, you would pay money just to sit in the class. My college students, they have no idea who I am. They have no freaking clue. They're just like, okay, some old dude with white in his beard is in front of the room and he's talking to us about, and I get more of a response after they graduate and be out in the industry for a while, and then they'll ping me over LinkedIn and they're like, wow, so you actually are kind of, I had somebody go, you're kind of a big deal. And I'm like, yeah, I guess, I suppose. I don't know.
I mean, so I'm a big fan, and even it happens a lot, especially with you and people who are as prolific as you. I will Google something and I find an article, sometimes 20 years old, and I'm like, oh, that's really useful. I wonder who wrote this. Oh, it's Ted. I should send that guy a thanks. like whatever, just something from late 90s or whatever on Java or IBM or with some blog. And of course, it might be on .NET. I love that you have this incredible presence in the .NET community and now in the Kotlin community. And apparently you're doing iOS as well. That's super cool.
Yeah, and truthfully, .NET and Java are really the two communities that I have any presence whatsoever, right? If you walk into a room full of Kotlin developers, I'm not a GDE, right? Google Dev Expert. And, certainly the folks over at JetBrains know who I am because, we've been talking for years, but, I'm just a guy as far as a lot of these other places, right? We go to the Seattle JavaScript, user group here in the Seattle area. Was there last week, and most of the people in the room are like, "Who are you? Oh yeah, you're not Kent Dobbs. You're not some of the names that we've recognized. You're not on YouTube. Okay, whatever. You're just
you are now.
Guy yeah. So, and truthfully, I kind of don't mind, right? I kind of, it's there's a certain point where you don't want to be like the one that everybody in the room is hanging on their every word. You don't want to be the uber popular. There was a time I absolutely wanted to be that in any technology community that I was in.
Yeah.
And now it's like actually kind of more fun to let other people have the stage and let other people, do that. It's part of the reason why I made the shift to management, right? I actually run teams more than I do code. And because I like building out people, I like watching my teams get better. I like watching the people that I have mentored. I like watching my college students go on and do, various things. One of them actually created a startup that got bought by Riot Games a year or two ago. And I'm like, dude, massive payout. He's like, most of the payout covers our expenses. So small payout, but I'm like, still, you have you have one more successful exit under your belt than I do. And, we laughed about that. So, that to me is kind of the more fun. And I still code, and I still, obviously if you're going to go teach mobile development, you have to be able to code your way out of a Kotlin sized paper bag and code your way out of a Swift sized paper bag. But, I'm not going to stand up here and say that I'm any kind of Kotlin expert, not in any stretch of the imagination. And there are occasionally things that, Kotlin still surprises me. Like, oh, they added that? Okay, that's kind of cool. All right.
So here's where you and I are. One of the reasons why people do hang on your words when you go to shows, because you're one of those people that can walk around at a Java conference, and I've known you for, I've appreciated you and known of your work a lot longer than you've known me, certainly. But I've known you.
Wait, was that you hiding in my garage back when I was living in Northern California? Were you stalking me back then?
No, that started.
I'm teasing you, Josh.
No, I'd say we've been friends for at least a decade now, but I don't know.
Oh yeah.
I started being visible in the community in 2010. So now I don't know where I'm sure I would have been, because I have old GeekCon photos of you from when I was like several sizes thinner, and I had more of this.
One of my first memories of you and me hanging out was an event where I think you brought your mom with you, or was it? Yeah. And and I think it was over in Europe, and we were hanging out.
In Russia?
It wasn't Russia. I've only been to Russia once.
I think it was Poland.
Poland. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Poland.
Econ or something, or 33rd degree or whatever. Yeah.
One of those, right? There have been a couple before. Devox kind of seems to have swept the stage. But yeah, it was one of those because it was a smaller event, and we were hanging out for dinner and so forth, and it was like, oh, that's really cool, because I think that was one of the times when I didn't bring my wife with me, which I often like to do, for many of the same reasons. More fun to do an event with somebody than without.
Also, my dear sainted mother, my goodness, she's I don't know if I told you this. I'll share with y'all. My father, I've got two dads. I've got like my mom's current husband and my second dad, basically. And my first dad, he passed away in 2019. Both of them are the best people ever. I don't deserve either of them, but somehow I got both of them. All that said, my first father, you know, he was 81 when he passed away in 2019. So you can imagine the years. You know, he was getting up there. And so I in 2012, he'd never been out of the country, whereas I had been out of the country.
Yeah.
And my parents, and that's because they worked lots of work. They had lots of jobs and worked hard, and we weren't particularly affluent or even middle class. We were like low middle class. It's not like we were like a Sarah McLachlan commercial away from food, but you know, it wasn't, but still, it was like low middle class, you know, and like
right.
They weren't on flights to destination vacations in Europe or whatever. So I took my dad with me in 2012 when he could still walk, and we went to top and bottom of Europe. We went to Stockholm and then to Spain, Madrid. You know, and
yep.
two extremes you could never get, right? And we had a grand old time, and I was like, okay, I'm glad I did that, because then a few years later he became sort of intractably sort of homebound, you know, and
yeah.
And then my mom, same thing, and I took my mom with me a year later. I took her to France and London, which of course, you know, your starter pack for Europe if you're gonna venture out.
Right.
It's the closest thing to Disneyland, you know, like, and then from there, my mom, she liked it, but she wanted to go to. Again, I don't know, for people who are watching, you got to understand there's a whole generation of people here who never thought people would set foot on the moon, or that people would set foot in America, or that Americans would set foot in Russia. That is the same as the moon. It is North Korea to them. It is, or Cuba. Yeah. That's another thing people don't realize. In America, there's a whole generations of people that never thought they'd get to go to Cuba since the 60s.
Oh well. This is where my international relations history background comes into play, because I was one of those who thought I'd never set foot in Russia, because I was born in the early 70s. So I grew up during the height of the Cold War, et cetera.
Right.
And my grandfather did a round the world tour, which included a stint in Moscow. And he tells us, told, because he's passed away now, but he told the story of how they were out, you know, with their tour group, and they were seeing various things, and he had a camera around his neck, and they were told no pictures. But my grandfather, who just, you know, he's such a contrarian ass, he really is. He's just kind of doing this as he's moving around, right? Just, you know, well, they get back to the hotel, they go downstairs for lunch. When he comes back to his hotel room, his camera is opened and all the film from their luggage is gone.
Wow, they were not kidding.
They were really not kidding. And obviously somebody spotted him and reported it and blah, 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 blah. So, you know, that was Soviet Russia. And then, of course, you know, the wall comes down, and, you know, the fall of communism and blah, blah, blah. And the in between then and now, right? Because now arguably we're getting closer back to Soviet era Russia, which is a whole different political discussion we won't dive into. Yeah. But one of the fun things was going to St. Petersburg. What I grew up with as knowing as Leningrad, right? Mm-hmm. And doing JokerCon out there, which was a great event, and I really enjoyed it, and I met some fantastic people while I was in Russia, and felt you know, really bad for them when all of the, you know, when Putin started exerting more and more control over the country. I don't like the country, but a lot of the people there I really, really enjoyed, and you know. There's a lot of places in the world that I thought I would never set foot in, that, you know, things have conspired. Yeah.
Well, so this is the same exactly. And I get goosebumps just thinking about it, because it's like, I don't know if I'll ever go there again. You know, who knows what the future looks like. It's just weird, but I'm glad my mom got to set foot there and meet some people and make friends. And, you know, it is so, the world is, I mean, and again, you and I are different generations, and certainly our parents are different generations than us, and yet, you know, like the windows of opportunity to connect and all that, it's just weird. So I'm glad I've only brought my parents on a few trips, but it meant the world to them. They just
Yeah.
they haven't been able to really leave the country.
Well,
My
the
mom's-
nice thing is, go ahead, your mom.
No, she's still around. She could conceivably go on more trips with me if we
Yeah.
decide.
Yeah. One nice thing, my folks are both still around, right? And
Congrats.
both of them, again, delightful people, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned that I do a lot of stuff in the .NET space. Microsoft has had pre-pandemic an annual event up here in Redmond, and I would frequently have a bunch of folks over to my house as part of hey, everybody's in town, let's party. Well, the last couple of years before the pandemic, my folks actually came out because they kept hearing about this party where we would, make a whole bunch of food and 200 people would show up at the house and we would have kind of a raging party. And so my folks have had the opportunity to meet a ton of these geeks from all over the world, including like the Swedish MVPs, the Microsoft valued professionals, that brought with them a bottle of wormwood schnapps, which is the most terrible thing ever. Don't drink it. It's just awful. But they had printed up little slips of like a Swedish drinking song. They had printed it phonetically. And they were insisting that everybody had to sing this Swedish drinking song. And I swear to God, it sounded like the Swedish chef from the Muppets. And then you shoot this thing and die because wormwood schnapps is awful. It's terrible. But
is this a PHP story? Is this the preamble to a PHP story?
You owe me an apology, sir. I would never sully this show with anything PHP. I made sure to clear all PHP off of my screen, before. So,
okay.
Thought you knew me better than that, Joshua Long.
I kid. No, so okay, my friend. Look, all that to say, you're an international known quantity for obvious reasons, and part of that is you're just sort of deep in these amazing communities. I love the .NET community. I love C#, the language in particular. I think that's a beautiful language, and I'm keen on your perspective, having learned and worked with C# on something like Kotlin, because to me it feels like Kotlin is as close as we come to the glory that is the C# language on the JVM.
All of my .NET friends, if you're watching this, please cover your ears. I have grown a little disenchanted with the C# language. They keep piling too much stuff into it, to be blunt. Kotlin is striking a good path in terms of how it approaches and how much of what we do should be in a library or should be syntactically flexible versus how much should actually be baked into the language. Richard L. Burton here says, reminds me of what happens with Scala. There's a lot of similarities there. There really is.
Yeah.
There's, the C# language designers, in many respects, they keep finding new and interesting things, and they're like, oh, let's put that in. Let's put that in. Let's put this other thing in. And so, they haven't published a C# language specification since C#4, I think. And I'm pretty sure
5 or whatever.
Well, they're up to 8 or 9 or whatever now. I mean, 11 or 12. And that's the other thing, is the numbering system is completely screwed up. It's really hard to know what version of the language you're using at any one given point. But I mean, they've folded so many different things in, and Kotlin has resisted that urge. It would be tempting, right, to say, oh yeah, bright shiny new toy, let's throw it in here and go. And they've really resisted that urge. And in many cases, what Kotlin has done, partly because they've been, they've added some of the flexibility around, for example, if it can be inferred without them, Kotlin will let you leave out the dot and the parens, which means now we can introduce things that look like keywords, but they're not. They're just extension methods. Yeah, all of that stuff, right? And so, that actually makes the language longer lived and less top heavy, less. And so, yeah, there were a lot of things that C# introduced, particularly C#3, C#4, I think was kind of pinnacle of the language. And, we can
There were
argue
link,
about async. Yeah, link was introduced in C#3, right?
right?
And we can argue a little bit about 5, but then after that, it really starts to feel like they're sort of on a runaway trolley headed downhill because they just keep adding more stuff, and in many cases, all it's doing is adding a synonym for doing something you could already do. And
Well,
so,
okay. What do you think of Java's recent growth spurts?
so first of all, I need to state for the record, Your Honor, that Brian Getz is a friend of mine.
Okay,
And Brian and I had some
appeal to sympathies.
conversations. Well, I mean, just full disclosure here, right?
Uh-huh.
You tend to be a little biased by things your friends are doing, etc. And
Certainly
Brian's a ridiculously smart guy, and I think his approach to all of this has been more measured. It's been more reluctant, more conservative.
Yep.
And I think what you see them doing is very slowly and cautiously, approaching. They look at everything that is being done everywhere, right?
Yeah.
I remember sitting in a hotel lobby with him in Germany, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, talking about some of the various things that Scala was introducing. And he's like, yeah, I can see that. That would be interesting. I can see, and this was before he was the Java language architect, if I remember. One of the things, of course, you have to be careful with Java is all the backwards compatibility issues, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But, you don't see them really rushing to embrace a lot of the things that would really significantly change the Java syntax. In many cases, they're being more measured, and they're trying to avoid some of the let's just throw a bunch more keywords into this and see what happens, right? Now, I'll be the first to admit, right, both C# and Java, I haven't really tracked all of the proposed language changes and all of the current language changes. I know Java is up to 21, but the last time I looked, for example, Java had still resisted the idea of, introducing async and await keywords the way C# did, which then really sort of permeated / polluted the rest of the .NET code base, because
Yeah.
now every time you write a method, you also have to write an async equivalent of that method and suffix it with async,
Right.
right? So if there's hello world, there's hello world async, just to be able to make sure that there's an asynchronous version, and it's just blah, right? And Java has resisted that. I think that's deliberate. I think they have, made that decision to stay away. What's up?
I am gonna do you one better. I think that what Java has done is the absolute best version of this feature in any language out there, and the only thing that comes even close is Go, which because Go had when you write code that does a seemingly blocking thing behind the scenes, it's non-blocking, and that's been the case.
Oh, the coroutines, Go routines. Yeah.
But that's been the case since 1.0, and it's always been that way. Java did something even more amazing, which is that they've made it so that they can add this feature to a language that is nearly nigh on 30 years old, and existing code with but one little constructor change or one factory method change now benefits from that non-blocking nature. That's far more impressive than starting from the get-go, foreclosing on all those existing, like Go just started one and only had the one, so of course it works nicely and consistently. Java did that retroactively. It's just so good, so good.
Yeah. Well,
huge.
And the seal. I mean, this is one of the fun things about being in both the Java and the .NET worlds, right? Is you can see them sort of stealing from each other on a regular basis, because the CLR had fibers, right? They actually introduced similar capabilities or made provisions for the capabilities in the CLR back during the C# .NET 2.0 era, because this was when they were putting the CLR inside the database, inside the SQL Server. And the SQL Server team, they had opinions, right? They wanted to control the garbage collector. They wanted to control how threads were run and allocated. They wanted to control everything. So there are a bunch of hooks inside the CLR to be able to, get at that. And, the .NET community went, fibers. Yeah, we've had those at the operating system level for the longest time. And everybody kind of went, meh, and moved away, right? They just didn't care anymore. So the .NET folks kind of went, oh, okay, cool. Well, we'll just keep going with what we've got. I hope the Java community doesn't do the same, but this is where, Java 5, look it up, one of the early JSRs was going to introduce isolates, which was going to be an in-process, in environment, which were almost a complete mirror image of .NET's app domains, which .NET later abandoned because they said, yeah, we don't really need this anymore. And isolates never made it out of the proposal stage. It was supposed to be in Java 5, and it turned out it was going to be a huge amount of rework to fix in terms of the code. And so the JVM engineers just said, we'll just shove that off to the side. And for the longest time, JVM engineers would come up here to Seattle and they would meet with the CLR engineers and vice versa. These two groups, even during the height of the sniping at one another, they were still learning from each other. And it's so easy to trace sometimes where these features come from when you see both sides of the fence. So it's kind of fun. It's kind of cool.
I think C# is the first one to have async await, right? Or .NET is the first one to have the syntax for async/await, and then that got cargo culted into Python and Rust and JavaScript and
I think the actual etymology, and this is from memory, and I could be wrong about this, but if I remember correctly, JavaScript actually gets to claim this, because when JavaScript, so the etymology here is, I can tell, and I haven't done a significant research here with timelines and whatnot, but I believe JavaScript with node callbacks, that's where this begins, right? You pass in a block of code, you pass in a callback, and then callbacks begat promises.
Right.
And then promises, the ECMAScript committee said, we can take the .then, the .and, et cetera, we could actually fold that into the language syntax, right? And from there, that's when they proposed async and await, which I think is when the C# folks said, that's actually a pretty good idea. We'll fold that into the language. So C#, you could say, is the first statically typed to introduce async and await as keywords in the language, although I'm pretty sure JavaScript, is vying with them for that honor. So
that's because that means that async await is newer than 2009, which is when Node.js came out, right? Like that blows my mind, actually. Also, it's important to remember that like JavaScript isn't a language; it's what you get when you have no time to build a language. So C# is the real first language to have async await. I'm still correct. It's just
I'm gonna fight you on that, buddy. I really am. Right? JavaScript, the origins of JavaScript notwithstanding, JavaScript is basically a Lisp with curly brackets and some additional features that people put in because nobody wanted to just admit that it's a Lisp with curly brackets, right? Everything you hate about JavaScript is because they put those features in to make C++ programmers shut up and be comfortable.
Yes, right. But what do you think of the DHH? There's this whole, Daniel Hannemeyer Hansen,
Dave Hannemeyer Hansen. Yep.
That guy, Ruby on Rails guy. And he's started this whole sort of backlash against TypeScript, right? Which makes me sad because TypeScript, like fundamentally, JavaScript is not. There's no type system, and so therefore, TypeScript is not a compiler; it's a linter for an unsound type system, and so it's not really good, but it makes you feel better. It's a comforting thing to have before you go to sleep, but it's a lie, but it feels better. It's like drinking alcohol to feel warm in the winter. It doesn't actually work. It makes you colder, but you feel better immediately, But
tell us how you really feel, Josh Long.
Well, I think it's an abomination, all of it. But that's I've made no bones about any of that. All I'm trying to say is, at least TypeScript gives you the sense that you've got a type system even though you don't. But Daniel, DHH for short, seems to have very vocally gone out and said, no, I reject your types and all that rigmarole, and I want to just embrace pure JavaScript. Did you see he did this blog that set off a little backlash a few months ago?
So I haven't read DHH's blog,
You're lucky.
I do remember having these exact conversations with guys like, Neil Ford and Glenn Vanderberg and Mark Richards and so forth during the heyday of the No Fluff tour, right? Essentially, nice, Richard.
Thanks for nothing.
Realistically, I mean, first off, JavaScript has a type system, right? You cannot build a language without there being some semblance of a type system, because JavaScript has some semblance of types, right? Because, they have a notion of a string type. They have a notion of, what an integer is, et cetera, et cetera. And they are able to do some interesting optimizations based on the fact that, so for example, if you add two numbers, you're not actually making method calls and whatnot. You're actually getting down to the point where two assembly instructions, there's a dot add there, and it's as fast as it is in any other language. And this was, frankly, all of the same criticisms that were leveled at languages like Smalltalk back in the day of C++.
Right.
The interesting thing is, one of the things that the Smalltalk community did was they actually figured out ways in which to optimize all that dynamic code to be really fast, and they put that into an optimizing virtual machine, which they called Strongtalk, which was later bought by a company, which then folded that into that purchasing company's virtual machine, and it became known as Hotspot.
Yeah.
All the things you love about the Java just-in-time compiler came from all the optimizations that the dynamic language community was doing. And Strongtalk, the source code, is still out there somewhere if you want to pull it down and look at it. Compare the Strongtalk source code to the OpenJDK code. You can see exactly where the lineage is. You can see how all of that came to be. So the performance argument is not really the performance argument is not really an argument. And as far as
I didn't make that argument.
Well, but I'm working up to it.
Okay.
The part of the thing is the type safety argument. JavaScript will not let it is type safe in the sense that it does not allow us to do any sort of unmanaged access, which of course Java and C# both do as well. So you already get a measure of safety there. And when you say, hey, when I pass a thing in, I don't know if this is supposed to be a number or a string or whatnot.
Yeah.
What we're starting to see, and if you look at languages like Python, for example, and there are some experiments in the Ruby space, and I predict they'll probably start showing up in the JavaScript space as well, we are starting to realize that neither statically nor dynamically typed languages are the answer. It's really a combination of both. Because the arguments that Neil and I in particular used to have, Neil was a big Rubyist at the time, back when Dave Thomas was really pushing Ruby back then, before he had
Pickaxe
jumped
Dave,
into his
not
right. Yeah, Pickaxe, the Pickaxe book. One of the things about dynamic languages is they really allow you to be more expressive, that I can just do things in the language regardless of whether the language was originally designed to do that. Whereas in a statically typed language, it's much harder to do. You have to worry a great deal more about syntax and so forth. And one of the things that dynamic languages often allow for is being able to create new axes of design that we don't see in a statically typed language, or in a statically typed language that doesn't incur a huge performance hit. And the poster child for this is reflection. Every time you use any of your favorite object relational mappers that go into the database and extract a row of data and then use names to bind them to the elements in a class, all of that is essentially what you're doing in a dynamically typed language. And it would be a heck of a lot faster to do in a language like JavaScript or Python. And frankly, reflection, as Java understands it, is really only half the story. The other half is being able to change those method implementations and being able to do some of the monkey patching, right? Where we actually replace existing implementations with something else, or we decorate it.
Yeah.
And frankly, all of that is what gave us languages like Aspect-J. So there's a tremendous amount of power there. But you know, Neil said it once best. He's like, look, if you want to juggle chainsaws, you better know how to juggle, and you better be comfortable around chainsaws. Otherwise, go back to using, a knife and a hatchet and all the safety gear and so forth. As a developer, do you really want your language protecting you from yourself, or do you want your language allowing you to do what you want it to do? Where do you feel on that continuum? And frankly, that is really a personal choice or an organizational choice, whether we're talking about code or whether we're talking about databases, right? SQL versus NoSQL. It's often the same discussion.
We're gonna agree right there. You just found the perfect juncture. If you're cool juggling live chainsaws,
running chainsaws,
then you should be using JavaScript. That's fair. We agree on that 100%. I'm good. We can leave it there. You win. That's the way. We're on that same page. But I'm not. So I'm gonna just not juggle chainsaws. But I get that people want to. By the way, I love like small talk. I mean, have you ever used Objective-C?
Oh yeah. iOS developer over here, right? You can't go too far without running into it. Yep. I
love Objective-C because of the small talk influence, that message dispatch as opposed to method invocation. So, that is such a good, but it's also got a type system, right? Which is nice. You mentioned monkey patching, right? For JavaScript and Lisp and the like. And I wish Java had some more of that metaprogramming, but certainly you've seen in Scala and in Kotlin, you do have these extension functions and this ability to override things while still keeping the compiler sort of in the loop of what's happening there. It's just
really
amazing you get when you mix this stuff.
Like playing with small talk, if you really like that whole sort of block-based approach, there is an existing language called IO, literally the letters I and O. It's native, but it's very, very heavily influenced by Smalltalk itself and some of those others. And then Olabini, who's a name that I haven't heard in quite a long time.
Is he out of prison?
I believe he was released finally. I believe I've seen tweets from him from in Ecuador, which is where he's been residing. But I believe he has been formally released, and I think charges were dropped. But I knew Ola when we were together at ThoughtWorks, and if you've not heard that name, Ola Bini, Bini, Ola had
Enterprise JRuby book. Such a weird, wonderful book.
And Ola was one of those who really, he was one of the guys that I could really kind of geek out with around languages. One of the few people in the world I met who had ever written OCaml in a non-trivial way. And, just ridiculously sharp. And he talked a great deal about, the intersection of static and dynamic languages and when and where you would want to use each. And it really was a profoundly influential post on my own thinking about how we approach things and where we should be using some of these languages. So
this is why I like what you said. There's a spectrum, a continuum, right? And I do think it's got to be somewhere. I think Java strikes a nice balance, being pretty dynamic, but also having a compiler and some upfront validation. Kotlin does a better job still, but the absence of all that is where I get a little. Man, Ola. So for people who don't know about Ola, he was caught up in that whole paper, the
WikiLeaks and some of the follow up. And Ola is a extremely progressive personality and got caught up in a lot of the things, and frankly was persecuted by the Ecuadorian government, for it. I don't necessarily agree with all of the choices that he made, but I mean, Ola is nothing but a straight shooter, solid type individual. All of my interactions with him, if he said if he said the sky is red, I would start looking for the evidence that suggested why he believes the sky is red. I mean,
Right.
because, you know, he's too smart to not say that without there being a reason, right? And he created a JVM based variant of IO called IOKE, which was really fun to play with. Right now, I don't think it's seen any update in probably 10 years, but it really starts to kind of, open your brain a little bit in terms of these different language designs. And one of the things that many of these block-based languages will teach you is that, for example, it's completely conceivable to have a programming language with no if keyword in it, because that's exactly what Smalltalk did, right? You have these Boolean objects that have an if true and an if false method. And essentially, depending upon which one of those, either the true instance or the false instance, right? If true or if false are basically a no-op, and then you pass in the block that is executed for the if true on the true object and the if false for the false object.
Right.
And it just starts to like, oh, this is metaprogramming in such a fundamental way. And you really start to see how the syntax between the keywords of the language and the actual constructs that we can build in the language really start to blur. And it really, really opens up all kinds of interesting ideas and so forth, which I personally, that's one of the things that F# does better than C# in many respects, in my opinion, is it doesn't rely on language. Yeah, Scala to a lesser degree, but still, they were both coming from some of the same space.
FD
they really said we don't want to like introduce all these new keywords in the language. We want to keep the keyword space very, very small, but we want to have all of these concepts. And if JavaScript were not hamstrung by its C-based family language history, it would be able to do a lot of the same sorts of things. Which is why, I was kind of voting for some of the other languages on the JavaScript ecosystem to win.
Right.
But TypeScript clearly resonates with the C# and Java developers of the world because it's very, very similar. And you know what? That's actually cool, because particularly when you're building some of those foundational pieces, that was part of Ola's, inverted pyramid. The closer you get to the operating system, the more you really need those type guarantees. When you get up to the top level, like when I'm talking to my kids about Android development, I'm like, look, you're top of the stack. You don't care about public and private. You don't care about encapsulation. You don't care about so many of these different things, because nobody's ever going to use you as a library. You are literally the top of the stack code. So many of those rules that are painstakingly drilled into you in your intro to Java class just don't matter anymore.
Great question here. Great question from the community. Speaking about languages, what is your take on the Swift language? Can I go first? I like it. It reminds me of a really, really, if you've done TypeScript or Kotlin, there's a lot you can just pick up quickly. But I do like it, and I like LLVM as just a platform as well. And it makes sense that Kotlin native is also targeting that, because it's just such a win, in terms of an ecosystem. Okay, that's the easy answer. What about yours?
No, my answer is very much a yes and, right? I like Swift. And part of the reason I like Swift is because they made a lot of the same sort of language decisions that Kotlin did. As a matter of fact, rumor has it that when Swift was first announced, some of the folks over at JetBrains were really kind of miffed because the syntax for Swift looks almost identical to that of Kotlin. Like, hey, they just stole our language.
Do you remember this? There were people from the Groovy camp claiming it was based on Groovy. There's people from the Scala camp claiming it was based on Scala, and there's people from the Kotlin camp claiming it was based on Kotlin. And I don't think Apple ever, in their secretive volcano manor hideaway style, I don't think they ever confirmed as much. I certainly didn't pay enough attention.
The language designer, something Latner, Christian Latner, I think his name is. I mean, he's no stranger to programming languages, right? So of course he looked at all of these, right? Because this is what language designers do. They get together at conferences and they're like, hey, what is your language? Oh, that's kind of a cool idea. I'm gonna steal that from my language, because that's what they all do, right?
When you describe that, I'm imagining a expo fair with people with like little booths with their language syntax sprayed on painted on the wall, and it's like, oh, would you like to try a sample of Ruby or try a sample of OCaml? Yeah, I don't know. The way you described it made it sound very cute and fun.
But that's exactly what they do, right? I mean, I'm an amateur language designer, right? I have spent a non-trivial amount of time thinking about grammars and code generators and so forth. And I spend time crawling GitHub periodically. I'll just do a search on GitHub for programming language and just look at the repositories that come up. The first, 100, instances, yeah, they've been around for a number of years. I'm looking for everything that follows after that. And people are out there constantly, like coming up with these interesting ideas and so forth. This is a crazy story. I was literally just playing StarCraft 2 a week ago. And well, but yeah, you see this, right? I am old. And was paired up in a session with somebody who turned out to be a graduate student also at the University of Washington, who is working on a new programming language called Husky, because of course UW Seattle are the Huskies, as everybody knows, because they lost to Michigan in the big sports ball game. Anyway, I'm like, oh, that's fascinating. So I start looking at this language, and so much of it is completely unspecified, completely left as a to-do, and those are the places that language designers love to rummage around. You've got the idea, it hasn't been so fully baked that you can often take it, hold it a little bit, permeate it. There are languages like, Red, that was based off of Rebol, which is also a block-based language, et cetera, et cetera. You're constantly stealing from everybody. Kind of like how Joseph Campbell says there's only like 7 basic plots to every story that every human has ever heard. Right. There's really only probably about a dozen concepts to any programming language and how you express it, et cetera. And Swift chooses syntax and semantics that are very similar to what we see in Kotlin, based off of what we've often, we've come to understand, right? We've learned a bunch of things in the last 20 years, such as inheritance is not really a vector for reuse, because that gets you into trouble, right? Witness the Java Lang stack or Java util stack class inheriting from vector, and we all went, terrible, which led to the design of the Java collections library and Java 1.2 and so on and so forth. We learn these lessons as we go.
Yeah.
And Swift, being designed at roughly the same time Kotlin was, Swift made a lot of the same answers. And, the interesting difference is Swift, out of the box, compiles directly to native code, which back in the day Kotlin didn't, right? So they had to make some interesting choices. The other is they really had to prioritize Objective-C backwards compatibility. And so Swift has some nods to the Objective-C message dispatch stuff that you don't see in Kotlin, because, key value coding, such a big deal in Objective-C.
I love it.
Completely absent from Kotlin, because it didn't need to be there. So,
and I wish that's one of my favorite things about Objective-C is like find by name and date, and and you can pass in these parameters that are part of the method prototype. It's just, it reads so much more nicely, and it's not about var args, it's not about overloads. It's just this really readable. Oh, it's so good. I'm a huge fan.
But this gets. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. What were you going to say? You were pointing at the screen.
One sentence, which is Chris Latner. He's the one who created Swift as well, right? Didn't he leave? I think he's no longer at Apple on Swift anymore.
I think I heard that. I think I heard that he had left Apple. But yes, he was one of the founders or creators of LLVM, which is one of the great back-end tool chains. I mean, it's one of the great targets, right? for any language. You see lots of languages that are targeting LLVM as a backend, which is great because it opens up so many things, including GraalVM. GraalVM will actually understand LLVM bitcode.
I keep waiting for Perl 6 Parrot VM.
Oh God! Oh God!
That's going to be the one. CLR, take that.
And Josh, here I had so much respect for you, and you had to go and say that. Oh my God!
I can't. Come on.
I being the virtual machine fetishizer that I am, I absolutely followed. I followed Parrot, and I really wanted to see where they would go and how they would approach it. And I think work has officially stopped. I mean, the code is still out there. But Parrot was interesting because they wanted to build a virtual machine that was specifically for dynamic languages, but they wanted to do it in almost complete absence of any awareness of anything that had come before, which is never a great idea. And I think the fact that they, what are we celebrating? The 25th anniversary of Perl 6's announcement.
Right.
I mean, they've never actually shipped anything.
Did they ship a Perl 7? I mean, did they just
no? Perl 6 has never shipped. Yeah, Perl out there is still Perl 5. Perl 6 never shipped, as far as I know. Parrot certainly never shipped. I mean, this is why because my understanding was Larry Wall was finally going to sit down and write a specification for Perl 6 because they had never had a language spec in all the years of Perl. He was finally going to write a spec.
Yeah.
And I think that was the last anybody ever saw of him. I mean, I would not be surprised if he's not like sitting in the basement of an institution rocking because the act of trying to do so, H.P. Lovecraftian style blew his brain. I mean, just
broke the brain.
He's
got a large beard and he's just scratching at his chin and at the wall,
incomprehensible symbols on the wall. I mean, Larry's a fascinating guy. I've had the chance to interact with him. What's that?
Well, first of all, incomprehensible symbols, that's Perl. It runs in Perl. But second of all,
there you go.
The State of the Onion. I used to love Larry's State of the Onion talks at OSCON, right, or wherever he did them. He did them all.
Yeah.
That was like, because he's hysterical, right? He's a really, really funny human being, and I loved his talks. But I don't know. It's a different time. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say I had the chance back when Perl 6 and Parrot were first getting started. I was at a foo camp. A bunch of us no-fluffers had been invited to foo camp. Dave Thomas was there. Jason Hunter was there. And Peter Drayton, who was a buddy of mine from Developmentor in the .NET space, he later went to go work on the CLR for a little while at Microsoft, et cetera. There was like hey, let's do a little, ad hoc virtual machine get together. And a couple of the Parrot folks were there. And, we sat down and, we were talking a little bit about virtual machine implementation. And Dave in particular, again, Pickaxe Dave, was really trying to drill in a little bit on how Parrot would handle some of the cross-language compatibility. If I take a Ruby hash and pass it over to Python, how does it behave? How does it act? And they said, oh, it'll be a Ruby hash. He's like, yes, but what's it going to look like from the Python side? Oh, it'll look like a Python hash, or it'll look like a Ruby hash. And they said, okay, but like if I use some of the, how are you going? And part of what we were trying to drill towards is the Microsoft folks spent a tremendous amount of time putting together a set of fundamental rules for their virtual machine that was codified in the ECMA standards for the CLR to describe how this thing would behave as all these different language came to party on top of the CLR. And the Parrot folks were just like, yeah, no, we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to, we're just going to hack and it'll just work. And all of us were kind of like, oh, you are so doomed. You are so doomed. And so I've been watching Parrot ever since because it was like watching, it's like watching a car accident in slow motion. You're just like, oh no, here it comes. So, there's a question I think in the chat here. I can't.
Your favorite and your worst or least favorite, I suppose, language. Hard to pick.
Well, my distaste for Perl has long been established, but now that Perl is kind of dead, I don't know that I have a least favorite language, really. It's kind of like the joke I will frequently use, because people would often come up to me, hey Ted, you're Java, you're C#, which one is your favorite? Secretly, what do you code in when nobody's around? You close the door and draw the curtains. You're all alone. Nobody, and the response I would often give is, those of you who have kids and have more than one kid, which kid is your favorite? And of course, the answer is, oh no, I love them both. But truthfully, if we're really honest with ourselves, we love our children, but we love them differently, right?
Yeah.
My oldest, he's a programmer. He actually works at Rocket Mortgage, as a matter of fact. He's been there now for a couple of years, loves it, loves the team that he's on. He is slinging C# and TypeScript and all this stuff that we've been talking about, loving it to death. Good. My youngest, he's a chef. He loves to cook. Cool. He does all these different things. And, I love them both. I love them differently. I can geek out with my oldest. We can talk about coding jokes, and, finally he starts to understand my programmer humor and, the XKCD, because he's lived some of them, and, some of the older Dilberts. He's like, oh my God, that's so funny because that just happened at work the other day, blah, blah, blah. My youngest doesn't get those jokes, right? My wife gets a little bit, but really not really, right? And that's kind of the way I look at all these different programming languages, because they're all different. They all like stress different things. They all have different approaches. They see the world differently. And so some of the things, more recently, I've been, with my copious amounts of free time, I've been running a D&D campaign for some of my friends from college, because we just do it online over Roll20. And I said, you know what? I always like, homebrewing, building my own world and creating some of my own rules, etc. So I'm going to do all of this in classic geek fashion. I basically built a website out of it, right? And the website is all, statically generated from Markdown using JBake, because that was one of the easiest SSGs to get going.
Yep.
But then I wanted to start building out, non-player characters that followed some of the same rules as player characters. And rather than tediously roll the dice and whatnot, I'm like, I have to automate this. Right. I have to automate this. And I know I'm going to have to do a whole bunch of crazy things using names. And so I said, I'm going to do it all in Python. And I'm actually going to embed the Python as code blocks in the Markdown. This is a style of literate programming where rather than putting comments to code, you put code inside of prose and then run tools to actually compile the code out of the prose. This is what Donald Knuth was doing with his web system.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was able to get the prototype up and running in seconds. I mean, it was just ridiculously easy the way Python approaches things, because I knew that was Python. That's how I could do it with Python. And so it's like, that I would never try to do this in C# or Java. I would never try to do this in JavaScript, because they just, you love them each differently and in different ways. So I don't really have a favorite.
Obviously that's the right answer. But for me, it's also it's not just the strength of the language, it's the thing you're trying to do, where the language might be one of many good choices, right? And so, and I think to Java's credit, it's getting a little bit better now that we have LLVM and all that, but still, like if you asked somebody 10 years ago, hey, I want to build a CLI, should I ship the JRE and a full jar with all your dependencies for each person? Come on. And then you see, and I love Python. I've been using Python since Bill Clinton was president, right? I'm a huge Python fan, but for the same reason, it doesn't scale as a type system, right? I use type hints now, but it doesn't make me feel better. It's just like a lie. I tell myself to go to sleep. But I've been using Python since 1.5. Truly big fan, but I wouldn't use that for a CLI either. And it was with some chagrin that I saw that Amazon and Azure did actually ship their CLIs with Python. I'm like, why would you ship this thing that has to have a runtime on every computer that ever uses it with that language of all things? You can, and so now you have I just think, CLIs are kind of underrated tools. I think people don't give them enough attention.
Preaching to the choir on that one, Reverend. I think a
Yeah.
strong CLI gives you options, gives the people using things options, particularly around automation, right?
Yeah.
You can't automate a GUI at all, but
Yeah.
you can automate CLIs and you can string them together, right? That was the core behind Microsoft's PowerShell, right? Yes, we can string text together in the common, Unix shell. Now let's actually expand that to string objects together, and that is the heart and soul of the PowerShell language, because it is basically a programming language that masquerades as a interactive shell. So
cool.
Anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you think of, just as we kind of wind down here? Oh, by the way, for those who are joining and you read my mind, because I didn't announce it anywhere, but if you read my mind, my original intent was to have a quick discussion here with my old friend Ted, and then we'd do a screencast. There's no time. There's just not enough time for that. We're gonna wind down on this discussion, and we're gonna stick to this, man. It's gonna be amazing. And so I'm gonna softball it here. Okay, you ready?
What he's trying to say, audience, is Ted talks too much, and therefore we have no time to go.
No. I'm saying Ted doesn't talk enough, and I'm really grateful for the time I've gotten, and I wish we had more. And so rather than forcing a screencast, I really am so, again, I please don't send me an invoice. I couldn't afford it. This is amazing. Amazing.
I'll tell you what, Josh, buy me a Coke next time we're at a conference together. We'll call it even, right?
Yes, sir. My pleasure.
There you go.
What is so CLIs, different languages. What are your thoughts on, there's this whole other discussion around like Go, Rust, Zig, on that side of the spectrum, the systems programming languages that I think is kind of interesting as well. People are sleeping inside the world, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the systems language, realistically, the reason you go for one of those is because either A, you're working on an operating system, right? Or B, you want to do exactly what you alluded to earlier. I want to build something that doesn't ship a runtime. I don't want to assume anything about the dependencies on the machine.
Right.
Which, if you scrape that away a little bit, you begin to realize that you always have to worry about dependencies, right? I mean, unless you are building the bootloader itself, you always have to. You make certain assumptions about what's present, right?
Right.
How many things. Yeah, I mean, even the JVM has to assume that libc is present somewhere on the machine when it binds to it. Now we start getting into all the world of dynamic libraries and SOs and DILD and DLLs and so forth, all the different operating systems and so on. So it helps with some of the dependency management, but system languages, what they really offer is some degree of predictability. Right? If the dependency isn't there, it just crashes and we're done. And, you can trace some of those dependencies and you can make sure to include it as part of your installer and blah, blah, blah. The other thing is, of course, you start getting into the issues of memory pressure. This goes back to some of the old arguments around garbage collection and knowing when and where things are released. And that's where a lot of these system languages are really, jumping in. Zig and Nim and a couple of the others. And they've got some really interesting ideas around that. I forget which one. I think it's Nim. Might be wrong. But one of them I was just looking at the other day actually has a construct in the language called defer. So essentially inside of a scope block, you can say defer and pass in a block here. And the idea is that this block of code will be executed regardless of how you leave the scope block. Which is exactly what C++. No, I don't think it's Go. I think it's one of the other ones because I wasn't looking at Go. I know that much. So the idea is essentially like if I allocate something right there immediately, I can write the defer block to unallocate it when we leave the scope block. But I can put that right snuggled next to one another because that's entirely why C++ introduced constructors and destructors, is to be able to tie the allocation and deallocation logic in the same place. But the defer blocks will all be executed essentially in the reverse order of their appearance at the end of the scope block, no matter how you leave. And I'm like, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
That's so brilliant because it's more general purpose than constructors and destructors. Because that was one of the things we got to in C++ was the RAII resource acquisition is initialization, right? Yeah. And so we would acquire something on constructor and release it on destructor, and it's like this defer thing. That's beautiful. That's awesome.
Plus, it has the benefit of keeping things lexically. It's all in one place. You know how things are being and freed and all that. You know
exactly. You know, so there's some really interesting, and that's the kind of thing that's, you know, heck, Java could embrace because it's purely syntactic sugar, right? A Java compiler could have a defer block and go, oh, sure, we can just tuck that at the end. We basically turn the whole thing into a try-catch block, and those are now our finalies. We're done here.
Exactly. I was gonna say that would be like a superset of the finally mechanism.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just like. And so these system languages are great because, you know, they usually control the naming of the symbols that come out of the executables, which makes it easy to be able to bind to some of the other stuff directly on the underlying operating system. I did a JNI talk for the Seattle Java user group here a number of years ago, where I showed, yeah, sure, this is how JNI works, and here are some of the proposed replacements for JNI. This was a couple of years ago. Yeah, exactly. But all of them are going to require that you be able to control the symbols emitted. So now let me show you a couple of different native languages. Let me show you how to do this in Rust. Let me show you how to do this in Nim. Let me show you how to do this in Zig, because you just have to get the names right. And now you can use your favorite system language along with your favorite runtime language.
Right.
And people in the user group were like, oh my God, we thought we were going to be bored to tears by C++. And we're not. This is like, oh, this is, you know.
Yeah.
And many of those system languages actually have now special packages for doing some of that, you know, Java native, you know, interoperability kinds of stuff. And it just opens up whole worlds, right? I love system languages. I mean, you know, first love was C++, right? That was the cute young thing that I fell in love with as a young impressionable programmer. And you never forget your first love, right? But C++ is not a cute young thing anymore. And a lot of the things they've done with the language, and it's like, oh, okay. I know why they had to do it, but this isn't the language that I knew and loved back in kindergarten. And, you know, we shed a tear for the fact that I'm now old and move on, right? Because C++, if you use modern C++, you can get a lot of the things that Rust and Nim give you. The problem is most C++ code is not modern, and the attempt to modernize it has not gone well. Excuse me.
Well, this is that Cambrian explosion of language features that we kind of were bemoaning in C#, right? Like, do you remember the JavaScript, the good parts, that book, which became a meme? Because it's like, there's JavaScript, the definitive reference is like this big, but then the good parts is like
big, and then exactly.
Right? And I think I worry about C. You could definitely already today you could do the same for C++. And if what you're saying is true about C#, and I have no reason to doubt you, I just don't know. Then maybe one day that'll be the same plight we find ourselves there, and you know, given a long enough extent, maybe that'll be also true for Java if in the sweep of 100 years, whatever.
Well, this is why I keep telling people, right? You know, we are using languages that were designed back in the late 80s, early 90s, right?
Yeah.
And we don't even use fighter aircraft designed back in that era, right? I mean, you know, the F-14, the F-15, the F-16, they're all being slowly retired out of the U.S. military. You know, Top Gun Maverick, right? You know, they jump into this thing and Tom Cruise, so it's been a minute, huh, Mav?
Yeah.
That really needs to be a meme where he jumps in and you see the instrument panel, you know, and then Rooster jumps in the back. Oh my God, it's so old, Java. You know, we really need to figure out, we need to take the next step. We need to get to the next paradigm, really, to elevate the abstraction level up. And that's part of why I keep looking at languages.
What is I don't know. So what are your thoughts on Q# and the quantum stuff, you know?
Until I can have a quantum computer on my desktop, it's cloud only, and realistically, it's not general purpose, right? I mean, you could do some amazing things with all the quantum computing and so forth, but that's one of the problems that people ran into. And a lot of our traditional development approaches don't hold anymore, right? You're not going to buy time. It kind of goes back to the mainframe era, right? When execution time was vastly more expensive than programmer time, So you don't do all of these things like unit tests and so forth. You just you carefully craft out what you're going to do, and then you submit it for execution. We're kind of back to that space when we talk about the quantum stuff. So, maybe before I die, I'll have a quantum computer on my desktop. Maybe, but I'm not holding my breath on that one. There are other things that I really think are interesting to go after long before we get to the quantum stuff. So,
yeah. My friend, I am so grateful for you, as always. This has been, I had no idea what I thought we were going to talk about Kotlin. We did. Technically, that was a thing we talked about, but so much better. This is so good. So good. Yeah, thanks. I hope you got something out of this, everybody. This is one of the best in the game, and one of the best people. Thank you.
And there's me, right? There's Josh, one of the best people, one of the best in the game, and then there's me.
Please. So. Thanks, everybody. Thanks. I think I'm actually keeping you from food. Like it's lunchtime, or no, it's well past lunchtime. It's near dinner time for you, but you're.
Yeah, well, we're a bunch of night owls over here. We typically don't do lunch until 3 or 4 in the afternoon anyway, so that's on us. But yeah, we're hungry. We're gonna get out of here.
We're both in West Coast, West Coast of the States. When's sunset for you? For me, it's like 4:30.
It's dark right now. It's twilight right now. Because remember, we are 2,000 something, 1,500 miles north of you, right?
Yeah.
So the solstice, I think it's dark by 4, and it's not light again until 8. I mean, ridiculously long nights. The flip side, though, is summer's here.
Summer's amazing.
Yes, absolutely amazing. So, all right, man. You take care. And we'll talk soon.
Bye, buddy. Bye, everybody.